It seems like talk about LLMs or large language models is everywhere nowadays. Whether it's in the news or with your colleagues or friends and family, everybody seems to be talking about ChatGPT and the capabilities of these generative AI algorithms. Your company may be interested in exploring and developing your own large language model, and you should be. They're very powerful, they can move your business forward in a variety of different ways. But there are some challenges ahead with LLMs, and some of those challenges may not be clear when you first start out. It's very easy for us to overlook them. There's at least 3 different items that you need to consider before starting developing your own model. I'll walk you through them. Welcome back, I'm Dennis, and I'm a chief data scientist with more than 20 years of experience. The current market for LLMs has new versions being pushed out constantly. And there's always talk about new prompts and new answers and new ways to use these LLMs. In all of that work and all of that hype, it's very easy to forget that a lot of work has gone into developing these LLMs. A lot of hours have gone into getting the final product that we get to enjoy today. The analogy that I like to use with clients is that looking at the current spectrum of LLMs is kind of like being at a bodybuilding show. When you're at a bodybuilding show, you get to see all of the athletes up on stage and they all look great, but you are seeing the very, very end of a lot of hours, thousands of hours that have gone into making that moment happen. So with LLMs, we have to kind of appreciate that there's a lot of things that we have to go through in order to get to a deployed product. The first part that makes LLMs challenging is the document collection and preparation that you're going to have to do. A good LLM is going to have content that is both deep and wide. What do I mean by that? When I'm referring to wide data, I'm talking about you're going to have to collect data that crosses different sources and types across your organization. In a lot of cases, you're also going to want to go outside of your organization and incorporate things like regulatory documents, or maybe you have a trade association that produces reports and you want to make that part of your LLM. The more diverse documentation you can give it, the more generative the answers that the large language model can produce for you. So it's really in your best interest to be as diverse as possible. For the depth of the data, you're going to have to realize that not all data is good data. You're going to want to set a minimum length for each one of these text points to make sure that each of the data points is long enough for the algorithm to learn from. Otherwise, you could be introducing a lot more mistakes than you'd like. Both of these items mean that you're going to have to spend a lot of time writing custom code in order to both take in and take apart the documents and in order to get the different pieces of data that you're going to need. You're also going to have to create repeating processes so that you can add new documents as they become updated, or as your LLM starts to grow and you want to bring in more items or updated versions of documents. You're going to have to write custom code to go ahead and keep that data feeding into your model. As a side note, you could also consider this when you hear about large AI companies like OpenAI and Anthropic talk about their staffing sizes. They probably don't have as many data scientists as you realize, or as you may think. They probably have a lot more traditional programmers that do more of the data sourcing and the dissection of that data. That's really kind of where the day-to-day work is of building your LLM. The second item I'd like for you to consider is the human validation portion of LLMs. A lot of the companies that have published their models right now have invested a lot of time and resources into this, and they've done a pretty good job. But in spite of that, they still make mistakes. The algorithm still makes mistakes when replying to you. These mistakes are often referred to as hallucinations. Your LLM, your custom LLM, is at risk of making even more mistakes because there may not be enough data, or the data may be a little bit too proprietary for your algorithm to learn on it properly. So your risk of mistakes is actually higher, which means that you're going to have to make a significant investment into the human validation to make sure that your algorithm is producing answers that you would like. You're going to need a fairly large team of human validators depending on the timeline that you want to deploy your model on. There's really not a lot of shortcut here. It's just something that has to be done, and it's going to have to be done on a continual basis. human validation doesn't really have a finish line. It's going to be an ongoing process. You may have multiple training cycles that your human validators are going to give you feedback on. You're going to need it when you deploy, and you're going to need it as you update your model. Every time you update your model, I recommend that you would go through a human validation cycle to make sure that the new data hasn't broken the previous version of your models. So there's no finish line here. You're always going to need some human validation. Finally, let's talk about costs. Like most companies, I'm going to assume that you don't have your own server room full of GPUs ready to go. That means that you're going to be relying on cloud providers to help you with that processing power. While we can expect prices to drop over time, GPU processing is still a fairly expensive proposition. And keep in mind that you may also need to go through a few training cycles in order to refine your model from one version to the next. I want to give you an example so you can understand some of the scale that could be involved in developing a significant model. In March of 2023, Bloomberg introduced their own GPT tool specifically designed for the finance industry. They went out and collected both documents related to finance and a lot of documents outside of finance, such as news articles and things along those lines. Combined, they came up with a collection of documents that was about 700 billion tokens. Now, for those of you not familiar, a token is roughly equivalent to one word in the English language. And it's important to know how many tokens you're dealing with, because the amount of tokens is how you're often billed by these large companies like OpenAI for their training time. So in this case, 700 billion tokens that Bloomberg used, we can roughly approximate to 700 billion English words. It's actually a little bit less than that, but for the purposes of this exercise, it's close enough. We can cross-reference that amount of tokens with some of the prices that are published by OpenAI, which would be a valid selection for your GPU processing power. They're obviously a very legitimate company when it comes to the generative AI industry. At the time of this video, prices for GPT-4 for us during the training cycle can be up to $60 for 1 million tokens based on the size of the model that you ultimately choose to use. With a little bit of math, you can come up with an approximate cost of $42 million for a training cycle for a model the size of the Bloomberg GPT tool, the 700 billion tokens. Keep in mind that these are the costs for just a single training cycle. If you have the human validation team, you're going to have multiple training cycles in order to refine the model from one version to the next. You may also want to update your model as new documents become available over the lifetime of the model. If you're in an industry that produces a lot of documents, perhaps a lot of press releases or things along those lines, you might find yourself updating your model on a weekly basis, maybe even a daily basis. That's going to add to your overall cost. And keep in mind that there's also a time investment associated with this monetary investment too. While GPUs are very powerful and the models are advancing, it can still take a bit of time for the processing. Now, your model may not need 700 billion tokens and you may not need the biggest model, but even on some modest training sizes and some modestly sized models, you're still talking about an investment that's measured in multiple days, not multiple hours. Now, I don't think that Bloomberg actually paid $42 million. I think they had other arrangements. But I wanted to give this example to show you what that potential scale could be. Your prices and your investment might differ significantly if you have a lot less tokens or you're willing to accept the results from a model that's not quite as big as GPT-4. I hope that these items haven't discouraged you from continuing with your own model. I just wanted you to go into this with eyes open. I'll see you next time.